Anybody who has been following the news recently would be aware that Manusmriti is back in the news again, with people trying to burn it, some trying to tear it up, and others opposing it. And this revives an old controversy around the Manusmriti. And it was this controversy which induced me several years ago to look more closely at the Manusmriti, largely because when I was in India, the impression I had of the Manusmriti was quite different from what I perceived to be the impression about it in the West when I came here to pursue higher studies. And that has ultimately culminated in the book, which Ojasvi referred to, with the title, From Fire to Light, Rereading the Manusmriti. What I discovered was, in pursuing this theme, that there were two aspects of the Manusmriti which had not been adequately recognized in the past studies. There was some awareness of these factors, but not enough for it to influence our assessment of the book. These are, first of all, the plural nature of the Hindu religious tradition. And the second is its historical setting. It is almost a cliche to say that Hinduism is a plural religious tradition. What this means is that when any issue is raised in the tradition or faced in the tradition, then it offers more than one answer to that question or that issue. That is what makes it plural. Now, when you have more than one answer to a question, you can accuse the tradition of being contradictory. Whereas the tradition would look upon it as options, not contradictions necessarily, but options to be chosen from.
Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. I welcome you to another episode of IndicTalks. Today, we will be discussing a book by the name of From Fire to Light, Rereading the Manusmriti, which provides an alternative reading of the Manusmriti. From Fire to Light accepts some of the conclusions associated with the existing interpretation, but presents them in a new light, mitigating and at times contradicting some of its features. In taking the plural character of Hindu tradition and the Manusmriti's historical context more deeply into account, it brings about a paradigm shift in our understanding of this text. The Manusmriti emerges as an attempt at social engineering, but of a rather different kind than imagined till now. To elucidate the same, we have with us the very author of the book, Dr. Arvind Sharma ji. We have engaged in a talk earlier this year with him as well, discussing Advaita Vedanta, touched upon its introductory forms, thereby helpful for acquainting oneself with it as a first-timer. Born in Varanasi, Dr. Arvind Sharma ji completed his early education in New Delhi and earned a bachelor's degree from Allahabad University. He joined the Indian Administrative Services in 1962. In 1968, he transitioned to academia, earning a master's in economics at Syracuse University and a master's in Theological Studies at Harvard Divinity School, focusing on comparative religion. He completed his Ph.D. at Harvard in 1978, translating and analyzing Abhinavagupta's commentary on Bhagavad Gita. Dr. Sharma held academic positions in Asian religions at University of Queensland and later at the University of Sydney. Since 1987, he has been the Birks Professor of Comparative Religion at McGill University. His edited works, Women in World Religions and Our Religions, are widely studied. He convened the world's religions after September 11th Congress in Montreal in 2006, underscoring his global influence in religious studies. Thank you very much for gracing our platform, sir, and I request you to take over from here.
Very good. Jaswiji, nice to see you again. Okay, so I think what I'll do is, I will begin by some remarks on the importance of the Manusmriti. Anybody who has been following the news recently would be aware that Manusmriti is back in the news again, with people trying to burn it, some trying to tear it up, and others opposing it. And this revives an old controversy around the Manusmriti. And it was this controversy which induced me several years ago to look more closely at the Manusmriti, largely because when I was in India, the impression I had of the Manusmriti was quite different from what I perceived to be the impression about it in the West when I came here to pursue higher studies. And that has ultimately culminated in the book which Ojasvi referred to with the title, From Fire to Light, Rereading the Manusmriti. So I would like to share with you the conclusions I have reached in this book. What I discovered was, in pursuing this theme, that there were two aspects of the Manusmriti which had not been adequately recognized in the past studies. There was some awareness of these factors, but not enough for it to influence our assessment of the book. These are, first of all, the plural nature of the Hindu religious tradition. And the second is its historical setting. Now, what do I mean when I say or talk about the plural setting of the Hindu tradition? It is almost a cliche to say that Hinduism is a plural religious tradition. What this means is that when any issue is raised in the tradition or faced in the tradition, then it offers more than one answer to that question or that issue. That is what makes it plural. Now, when you have more than one answer to a question, you can accuse the tradition of being contradictory. Whereas the tradition would look upon it as options, not contradiction necessarily, but options to be chosen from. I noticed that so far, when there is a apparent contradiction in the Manusmriti, it is perceived as a contradiction and not as an option. And so this was one recognition which came to a realization rather, which came to me while pursuing this theme. The second was the historical context of the tradition. Now, many scholars have noticed that if we place the Manusmriti in the 2nd century of the Christian era or the Common Era, then it comes at the end of a long period of foreign invasions of North India from about 200 BCE to about 200 CE. Although this fact is recognized, its possible impact on the reading of the Manusmriti, I think, is lacking. And let me illustrate this point with a rather, what should I say, almost dramatic, if not sensational view regarding the assessment of Ashoka. Now, Ashoka, of course, is hailed as a great political leader, as a great king, ruler in India, and justly so. But if we examine the material, we find that there are 3 assessments of Ashoka. One which you might call or identify as the assessment of Ashoka in world history. Second, as the assessment of Ashoka in Indian history. And now I come to the critical third one, the assessment of Ashoka in Hindu history. Now, in world history, he is hailed as the champion of peace before his time, and of course, a propagator of Buddhism. In Indian history, he is similarly hailed as a great king and well ahead of his times and a propagator of Buddhism. and as some person who spread Indian values throughout Asia. What has been ignored is the Hindu assessment of Ashoka. And I'd like to make a few points about that. The first is that Ashoka's favorite epithet in his inscriptions is Devanam Priya, the beloved of the gods. In classical Sanskrit, the expression Devanam Priya means a fool. How do we reconcile these two positions? I would like to suggest the following resolution by giving a modern example. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was a great Prime Minister of ours. But we know the consequences of his policy regarding Tibet towards China. It is a bit harsh thing to say, but some people might describe his policies as foolish. In fact, Zhou Enlai even described him as a useful fool. So the Hindu assessment of Ashoka's reign was that his policy of pacifism so weakened the defenses of the country that for about 400 years after the end of his dynasty, India was ravaged by first the Indo-Bactrians, then the Indo-Parthians, then the Scythians, and then the Kushanas. Now we should realize the extent of the devastation caused by these invasions. According to the Yuga, one section, I think it is called the Gargi Sanhita of the Yuga Puran, if I'm not mistaken. But the line says, Chatur Bhagam tu Shastrena Nashishyanti Praninam. Chatur Bhagam Harishyanti Shaka Shesham Swakam Puram. When the Shakas or the Scythians attack India, 1/4 of the population will be destroyed and 1/4 of it will be enslaved. This was the extent of the disaster faced by North India, for which the natives of the time apparently blamed Ashoka and his policies. In fact, in one of the texts, the statement is made, though not about Ashoka, about somebody else, Sthapashyati mohatma vijayam nama dharmika. Only a fool will proclaim dharma vijay, victory by righteousness. And I finally come to the third item of evidence in this context, and that is the inscription of Samudragupta on the Ashokan pillar. Why did he choose to inscribe his Prashasti, his panegyric, on the Ashokan pillar? Now, you will recall that the Prashasti of Samudragupta is one of Digvijay, the military conquest of India. And could it be that there is an element of sarcasm in his inscribing his own conquest on a pillar of a king who was against all military conquest, as if to say, this is what kings do, what I have done, and not what you have been proclaiming. So if we take these things into account, then we will have to recognize that some of the things we find in the Manusmriti represent the reaction of the members of the Vedic tradition to the consequences of the policies followed by Ashoka. This enables us to see the Manusmriti in a new light, and it is this. The Manusmriti is an attempt to reorganize Hindu or rather Indian or Hindu society and polity after the devastation caused by, in the assessment of the natives of this tradition, followers of this tradition, to the policies followed by Ashoka. So this is the general argument I've adduced in the book. This might seem a bit far-fetched, but we could look upon Manu as doing something which the Americans did after the end of British rule in India, and we did, Indians did, after the end of British rule over India. The Americans, to mark the end of the British rule, proclaimed the Declaration of Independence and created a constitution. We did the same thing after the end of British rule over India. Please remember that both these two are periods of foreign rule over a country, in the case of America and in the case of India. We can similarly see the Manusmriti trying to play the role of a constitution, to use a modern idiom, at the end of a long period of foreign rule. Now, it has some obvious limitations because this new constitution was being proclaimed by those people, by that tradition, which had survived this period of devastation. Which was that tradition? It was the Vedic tradition of the transmission of the Vedas, which despite these convulsions, managed to sustain itself. These people were priests, so they had obvious limitations in their worldview. And it's also apparent that they were trying to incorporate the political dimension of life into that tradition with the Manusmriti. So it was kind of an experiment also. So this is the perspective on the Manusmriti I'm trying to advocate through my book, which enables us to look at it in a new light. So these are my general comments. I'd like to make 3 specific comments over topics which are often associated with the Manusmriti. And these are, 1, the caste system, 2, the position of the Sudras, and 3, the position of women. On these, among other things, I have to say the following things in the book. The caste system, as we know it, as a system of Varna and Jati, is laid out in the Manusmriti. But I'd like to move directly to the idea that it is an oppressive system, a discriminatory system, and should be done away with. So my question is, does the Manusmriti allow us to abolish the caste system if we feel that it is not benefiting society? What do you think would be the answer? Yes or no? I like to urge that the answer is yes. And it is found in the chapter 4 of the Manusmriti, where it clearly says, Parityajet artha kamavyau syatam dharma varjita. One should give up that earth and kam, which is opposed to dharma. And one can also give up dharma, dharmamapi, asukhodarkam, lokvikrushtamevachita. That dharma which does not lead to positive results in the long run, and which is condemned by the people, should be discarded. Now, if we wish to justify dharma, I beg your pardon, if we wish to justify the caste system in religious terms, we will say it is dharma. But Manusmriti specifically says that such a system can be given up. I think this will make more sense if we compare it to the provision for an amendment in the Constitution. Let us look at the American Constitution. The same Constitution permitted slavery. And then, around the 1860s, under the same Constitution, slavery was also abolished by Abraham Lincoln. How is that possible? Because the legal tradition associated with the Constitution provides for changes in the Constitution. The Manusmriti ditto. So these are my remarks on the caste system in relation to the Manusmriti. Now I come to the position of the Sudras. The general impression abroad is that Manusmriti held a very low opinion about the Sudras. I did not care much for them. Well, I think this is because people don't realize that according to the Manusmriti, one can even tell a lie to save the life of a Shudra. Please check chapter 8, verse 104. Do you think there's such a provision that you can tell a lie to save the life of a Shudra is consistent with the idea that Manu held the life of Shudras in low esteem? It is not. Similarly, Manusmriti says that your servants, Shudras, need to eat before you do. Is this consistent with the view that the Manusmriti only holds a negative view of the Shudras? So I've drawn attention to those parts of the Manusmriti which allow us to take a more charitable view of what Manu thought of. The underlying idea is that if we wish to present the views of Manu on the Shudras, then we should look at all the evidence from the book on that question. This brings us to another point regarding interpreting the Manusmriti. What I noticed was, and this is probably because of the plural nature of Hinduism, that on the same topic you find different views in different parts of the book. So before we pass a general judgment on that issue, we must look not just at one verse, but at the cluster of verses pertaining to that topic. And in an appendix to the book, I have given some examples of such clusters. So this is what I have to say about the second point regarding the Shudras. And the third point is regarding women. Again, the same point holds. Some people say Manu has nasty things to say about women. But the same Manusmriti also says, is a very famous verse, Yatra naryastu pujyante ramante tata devata yatra navasta pujyante sarva nishvala kriya. There, that place where the women are respected, honored, the gods revel in, that place where they are not, no ritual is efficacious. All your ritual activities are fruitless. This is the same Manusmriti. I also like to make a more general point about women in Manusmriti, which also seems to apply to assessing the role of women in Hinduism in general. And I would even go to the extent of saying that it applies to analyzing the position of women in any religious tradition. And that is this. We find a difference in what these traditions have to say when they are talking about women in the abstract and in general, and when they are talking about women in a specific roles. What do I mean by that? There are statements in Manu which condemn the character of women in general. In general, same thing is in Islam. Often verses are quoted from the Quran addressing the issue in general. But in Islam itself, there is the saying, heaven lies at the feet of the mother. So what I'm trying to say is that there's a difference in the way in which women are treated when they are talked about in general, and when their specific roles are discussed as mother, as wife, as mother, as sister, as wife, as daughter. And that when they are talked about in these specific roles, the account is often very positive, though there might be some doubt about this in the case of the wife. And when they talk about women in general, they seem to be almost misogynistic. And this is very true of the Manusmrti. Finally, before I ask you to ask me questions, I would like to make a general point about the general condemnation of women. The Manusmriti belongs to a tradition, namely the Hindu tradition. Within that tradition, it also belongs to a more specific tradition of interpreting the Vedas and the scriptures, and that is known as the Mimamsa tradition. The Mimamsa school of Hindu philosophy. The Mimamsa school of Hindu philosophy has a specific principle regarding how such passages are to be understood. This is a very important point. The Mimamsa Sutras deal with such issues. A commentator of the Mimamsa Sutras called Shabar has this to say: Nahi ninda, nindyam ninditum prayujyate. Something is not condemned to condemn it. Kimtari? Then what is the purpose? Tad itarat prasanshitam, to praise the opposite. The example is given. You tell your friend that you have been invited for dinner at the place of some person called person X. You know that person X is an undesirable person. So you tell your friend, eat poison. Are you asking him to eat poison? Or are you asking him to do the opposite, not go? It is very clearly, the point is very clearly made, not just in the Mimamsa Sutras and in Shabar's commentary, or even in the Puranas. It is specifically said that when these condemnations take place, the idea is to recommend renunciation of the world, not to denounce women, but to recommend the opposite, leading the monastic life, the renunciant's life. So I like to conclude by urging that when we interpret our own texts, then we should also take into account our own tradition regarding interpreting those texts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir, for laying foundation and clarifying some very infamous points that are extended in order to invalidate Manusmriti. However, one of my questions are, as you mentioned, the comparison of a constitution. So, constitution is often understood to be non-static and amendable, and we've seen that after Manusmriti, a lot of other smritis also came into being, like the Yajnavalkya Smriti, the Parashar Smriti, etc. Isn't that a reflection of the fact that the Vedic society was something that was acceptable of change, and it looked at Manusmriti to after a point do get subservient to the need for change, and then other smritis to come and prescribe social structure?
I entirely agree with you. In fact, this principle is laid down very clearly by Bhartrihari in his Vakyapadiya. And he says very clearly, I can quote the Sanskrit verse if you would like me to.
Please do so.
The verse says that the Shruti, the Vedas, the Shruti remain the same through the ages. But the Smritis change from age to age. Anadim avyavachannam shrutimahora kartrikam. Shishtai nibadhyamanastu navyavachidate smriti. So there are more than 40 smritis which are mentioned in the literature. So Shruti remains the same. Smritis change to make the rules of the time consistent with eternal values like truth, justice, and so on.
So, you mentioned that a lot of Manusmritis have been burned, and they have been always been a recipient of disdain. I think the most significant of those unfortunate events have been the one in 1927 where Ambedkar ji had burnt the Smriti. And he, of course, did it because he did not agree with how the Dalit community was described to be in how the Dalit community was told to do or was projected as in the Smriti. So I think it would be important for us to understand that when a respectable man like himself tends to disagree with the Manusmriti, how exactly can Hindus as a united unit, irregardless of their caste, find oneness on their position of the Manusmriti?
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let us first take the incident itself of Dr. Ambedkar burning the Manusmriti at Mahad. When this incident is mentioned, a detail is often omitted. The detail is that Dr. Ambedkar did not burn the Manusmriti. He had certain passages which he found offensive in relation to the Sudras, copied on a separate sheet. And that sheet was burnt. Why did he do that? He wanted to respect the text as a part of the tradition and at the same time also make his protest visible. Otherwise, he could have burned. Now, the people who burn it in our own times overlook, forget, or choose to ignore this fine point. Secondly, when he was drafting the constitution, he consulted the Manusmriti. In fact, he says that he was encouraged to give rights to women, especially in terms of inheritance, because Manu provides for it. So, first point to note is that the relationship of Dr. Ambedkar to the Manusmriti was more nuanced than most people seem to grasp or understand. The second point is that what do we do if we find something no longer acceptable in a text? We don't burn the text. We write another text with a new position in it. But there's a reason for it. Why did we not throw away the Constitution of America, the American Constitution, when slavery was abolished? This is conservatism in its best sense. You want to conserve what happened for two reasons. One, to be aware of how the change came about. But the other, and this might sound hard to digest, to keep all options open. Even options which on the face of it might appear unpalatable. Hinduism is well known as a tradition which keeps all options open. Which doesn't mean that it recommends all options. It recommends the best option for the occasion. Here's another example in an ecological context. Hindus are given to, quote unquote, worshipping trees and groves. At one time, this was ridiculed by the missionaries. Yeah. At one time, it was ridiculed. And now it is praised by the ecologists. You see the power of retaining all options.
That was a wonderful comparison, sir. Very helpful in understanding your point. I think one of the most important observations is that in Manusmriti, it's often said that remarriage is something that is not prescribed. But then we saw that Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar brought the reform of widow remarriage. Now, from a religious perspective, one can understand that ideas like divorce or second marriage or third marriage don't really make sense because the samskaras can only be committed to one person in one lifetime. However, uh, if you look at it from the view of the Manusmriti, do you think that this reform that came up much later is something that would be validated? And also, how did it see the polygamy that was practiced by the kings at that time? Because if remarriage is something that cannot happen either from the perspective that your spouse has died or the fact that your spouse is living and you're taking in another spouse, how exactly is remarriage looked at from Manusmriti? Because it is often proliferated that remarriage, especially for a woman, is condemnable.
Yeah, marriage is normally regarded as indissoluble. Yeah, yes. Although, I think the Manusmriti itself contains a term which means the son of a remarried woman. So here we have a tension between the ideal and the real. But let us look at this matter a bit more closely. Other Smritis clearly provide for remarriage. There is a famous verse, I think it is the Parashar Smriti, which was, I think, identified by Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Nashte mrite pravrajite, klibe cha patite patau, panchvat sapat sunarinam, patiranyo vidhiyate. In these 5 situations, a woman can remarry. Nashte, the husband is lost, not known about. Mrite, dead. Pravrajite has taken sannyas. Klibe is impotent and morally degraded. Patit. In these 5 cases, a woman may take another husband. So other Smritis clearly provide for it. But let me try to shed some light, as I see it, on why Manu is reluctant in this matter. And why does he have all these kinds of marriages, 8 kinds of marriages? I think part of the logic of this is that you cannot have an illegitimate child. Even if you rape the person, it is a peshach, is a diabolical marriage. And this, I think, would be a progressive stance there in the light of, in the judgment of most people. Who are the worst sufferers in a divorce? Children. Now we can take a more, maybe generous view of what might be lie behind Manu's thinking.
And so would it be right to quote the Manusmriti to also invalidate polygamy that was practiced by monarchy? Because in the case of monarchy, wasn't it important to have polygamy because it was going to be the Uttaradhikari who had to take reins? So then, how does it look at polygamy by the monarchs?
Now, royal polygamy, was the order of the day. Yes, especially among the Kshatriyas. But there were 2 reasons for it, maybe more, but at least 2. One is you needed to have an heir, male heir. Yeah. So you wanted to make sure that, and infant mortality being very high, you wanted to hedge your bets. Secondly, royal marriages were a way of consolidating your kingdom. You married the neighbor's daughter, which meant that you would probably go to war. And maybe at some point the 2 states would merge. And the way I think, we know famously how England and Scotland made British Isles as United Kingdom. Yeah? So it's a positive, it can play a positive role. This is where I have a trouble with what is known as the hermeneutics of suspicion. Have you heard this word? Have you heard this expression? Hermeneutics of suspicion? Yeah, okay. It's a kind of quite a popular expression used in the study of culture these days. The idea behind the hermeneutics of suspicion is that if something looks good on the face of it, it might turn out, if you look more deeply, that it is really quite negative. Yeah. You might say the relationship between husbands and wives is glorified, but the real reason is you want children. So you are suspicious of what you find on the face of it. And the great masters of suspicion are Nietzsche, Freud, maybe Foucault, and whom have I left out? Marx. What I'm trying to suggest is that we should also look at the hermeneutics of suspicion in the opposite way. That what on the face of it is negative may be concealing something positive, like the issue of royal polygamy. So we should make it work both ways.
So, while Manusmriti was important to make sure that the dharmic quotient of the society was retained, it was also, like I said, a social prescription. So, how did it look at marital crimes like domestic violence, for an example? Because, like you said, marriage was something that couldn't be dissolved. But the Manusmriti is not just supposed to uphold the religious position, but also provide social solutions.
Yeah, but let me back up a bit. Marriage could not be dissolved. Do you know what that means? That even if the wife committed adultery, she should not be thrown out?
Yes, I think Ahilya's story would be a good reflection of that.
Yeah. So it works in favor of women in this sense, if we want to look at it that way. So this is following up on the earlier point. Yeah, could you kindly repeat the question? I got a bit distracted. Yeah.
So my question was that Manusmriti is not just supposed to uphold religiosity of marriage, but also to provide social solutions. So in the case of marital crimes being committed, like domestic
Yes.
violence, for an example, how would Manusmriti navigate that?
Okay. If you take domestic crimes in a broad way, including depriving women of their rights, then Manu has a very interesting provision. That, okay, let me provide the background for this. Manu has what are known as differential punishments, right? For the same crime, for some crimes, if you are a member of the higher Varna, then your offense is less. So the Brahman is punished less than a Kshatriya, less than a Vaishya, less than a Shudra. And this makes it invidious, right? Okay. But in the case of crimes against women, it is the opposite. The higher the Varna, the higher the punishment. He is very conscious of the rights of women, and he specifically provides of any violence against women has to be, sorry, women has to be protected against any violence against them. Any violence against women is punishable. Now, you raise a very important issue which is now being discussed in India regarding marital rape. I don't know what views Mani's would be. I have not looked at the text from this point of view. But see, we'll make a very interesting point, important point here. You don't know how interesting it is, but it's important. Which is this: there is a difference between ordinary rape and marital rape. Why? In ordinary rape, there is no expectation of sexual contact with the other party. Marriage is based on that contact. That is why we find this hesitation in India in the question of marital rape. I think it probably should be recognized, but within the framework as something separate from ordinary rape, as a violation of the norms of marriage. Where, of course, Manu is very emphatic that there should be mutual consideration in this matter.
You're very right, sir. However, I don't think that the hesitation that stems in the men in today's time is because of their dharmic view of marriage. But that brings me to another very important social issue, especially if you bring in comparison the laws of America and the laws of India. So, for an example, let's talk about abortions. There, uh, a large community of men believe that abortions are sinful, and so the law there bans abortion. However, India is a country that struggles with feticide and infanticide. So, abortions are quite easy in India and they're legal in India. But Manusmriti says that the killing of an embryo is a heinous crime. So, how exactly do we find a middle ground which is not patriarchal, which is dharmic, and also something that caters to the social realities of marriage, a woman's life, etc., in order to understand what the dharmic position on termination should look like?
Okay. All of us will agree that Manu is an upholder of dharma. Do we agree on that? Yeah? Okay. So the question arises, what is dharma? What is Manu trying to uphold? There's a very interesting definition of dharma in the Mahabharata, in which a person goes to hell for telling the truth. A person goes to hell for telling the truth because it leads to the death of certain people. And then the principle is laid out, yad bhuta hitam atyantam tat satyamiti dharana. Truth is that which secures the well-being of everybody. Sarvabhuta hitam atyantam. In the extreme. So, abortion may be violence in some form. An ancient tradition or spokesperson of the ancient tradition may have condemned it. Yeah, but they did not have fertility procedures either at that time, right? So, we should not be held back in having the kind of provisions we have just because it seems to go against dharma, because the texts are very clear on this. The working of dharma is very subtle. Apparently, dharmic things can lead to a dharma. And this is the supreme test of dharma. What leads to well-being of everybody involved. So I think we should apply this higher test of what is dharma, of which we will, I think, also find resonances in the Manusmriti.
So, sir, would it be right to conclude that rule of law is supposed to cater to its citizens? And the citizen in this case would be the man and the women, the men and the women who have already been born, and not the ones who are in the process of being born. And
I have an important thought following from a previous question.
Okay.
Which I would like to follow. And you would say, well, that way anything goes. Okay, this leads to, according to me, this leads to my well-being, and therefore everybody's well-being. Yeah. The tradition is very careful on this point. When Manu says that you can tell a lie to save the life of a Shudra, or of a Kshatriya, or a Vaishya, or a Brahmana, it doesn't just end here. It says you have to also atone for having told that lie. You are allowed to break the rule when a higher end is involved, but you can't be casual about it. You have to undergo the penance. So, if we were going to have a dharmic resolution of the abortion issue, people who indulge in it should perform a mild atonement so that it does not become a rampant practice, right? As a form of birth control or something, You do whatever you like and then, yes, we will get aborted, if it is aborted. So to prevent flexibility from degenerating into opportunism, you have this other provision.
That is such a wonderful thought, and I think it brings so much peace to the entire issue. So my concluding question would be to talk about, actually, it won't be my concluding question, but I want to talk about what the Manusmriti talks about in terms of a woman's place in institutions beyond that of marriage and family. So in terms of governance, military, etc.
Good question. I haven't looked at the Manusmriti from that point of view, whether it allows for this kind of a role of women. I should do that. I'm trying to see if I can come up with something on the spur of the moment. Of course, the tradition of having queens is very ancient in India. There was even a proposal that when Ram goes for the forest in exile, goes into the forest in exile, Sita should be installed in his place. You know the argument for that? Husband and wife constitute one unit. This is in Manu. They are a single unit. So I leave it at that. I need to look at it more carefully myself before answering the question.
That is beautiful, actually. I just want you to reiterate how Manusmriti has been a tool of social engineering, especially after I read this particular quote by Patrick Olivelle, who's written Manu's Code of Law, a critical edition and translation of Manav Dharmashastra. He says that the composition of the text is thus divorced from authoritarian intent and agency and from social, political, and economic context.
He says that?
Yes.
My position is the opposite.
Yes, absolutely.
That it must be placed firmly
Mhm.
in historical, religious, and social context. And you can't debate first principles.
So I think it would be useful if you just reiterated how it's been a tool of social engineering in those contexts.
As I pointed out, or tried to point out earlier, society and polity was in disarray after 400 years of foreign invasions. And so what do? It's like after the War of Independence in America, society would be in disarray. And then they come up with a Declaration of Independence, which actually the war followed it. You have the Constitution and all. In India, we have the independence movement, and then you have to set up a new society. Similarly, Manu now has to address the issue of social cohesion and governance. Ab novo, from the beginning, once again. And this is very important. He has the disastrous consequences of Ashoka's policies in mind. So that haunts him. So he wants to avoid doing what Ashoka did. This might explain one very important point. In the Ashokan inscriptions, we find an expression, danda samata, which would apparently mean giving the same punishment. To everybody would follow, I think. Many scholars are puzzled by this expression, and they hesitate to take it to mean that everybody should get the same punishment for the same offense. A.L. Basham even writes that such an idea was inconceivable in antiquity. Therefore, it cannot mean this. Now, I respect Professor Basham. He was a friend, but I cannot agree with him on this. Somebody can come up with a bright idea even in ancient times. And it's quite possible that a person like Ashoka could come up with it. That contrary to the prevailing idea that people in higher varnas receive less punishment and so on, everybody should have the same punishment. That one reason why we have differential punishments in Manu may be because Manu, in our view, mistakenly associated this as a feature of that polity which led to the disaster which followed Ashoka. That is why he has differential punishment. Or maybe one reason why he has.
I think that was a very interesting question and answer session, sir. My most valuable takeaways would be the fact that the essence of Manusmriti lies in the fact that rather than condemning the condemnable, it is better to praise the opposite, and that truth is that which secures the well-being of others, but also must be met with penance. Thank you very much for enlightening us of how Manusmriti has provided a lot of facets of what present governance and present constitution making must look like. Thank you very much. We wish to have many such talks with you. Namaste.